There's a schoolyard rhyme that most people in America have heard at some point, even if they don't know where it came from. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. It's a dark little joke, sing-songy, and almost cute, the kind of thing children chant on a playground without fully understanding what it's actually describing. What it's describing is a real double murder in a real house on a real morning in August of 1892. A case so brutal, so strange, and so thoroughly unsolved that, more than a century later, it remains one of the most debated true crime stories in American history. A case built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence, decided by an all-male jury in less time than it takes to watch a single episode of television, and left, to this day, without a single person ever convicted for it. And the house where it happened still stands today in Fall River, Massachusetts. Not as a crime scene sealed off from the public, but as a bed and breakfast where paying guests can spend the night in the very rooms where two people were hacked to death, and where many of them report they were not alone. This is the full, true story of Lizzie Borden. Fall River, Massachusetts, in 1892, was a prosperous New England mill town, and the Borden family occupied a peculiar position within it. Andrew Jackson Borden, Lizzie's father, was one of the wealthiest men in the city. A successful businessman with interests in banking, real estate, and manufacturing, his personal fortune equivalent to something in the range of $10 million in modern terms. And yet, by nearly every account from those who knew him, Andrew lived like a man determined never to spend a dollar he didn't absolutely have to. The Borden home, despite the family's considerable wealth, still lacked many of the modern conveniences, including indoor plumbing, that families of far more modest means elsewhere in the same city already enjoyed. Andrew was, by multiple contemporary accounts, deeply unpopular in Fall River, known for his stinginess and, according to some later historians, for open prejudice against the city's Irish Catholic and Portuguese immigrant communities, prejudice that reportedly extended even into his own household, where he was said to have cut off heating to the small room occupied by his family's Irish maid. Andrew had been married twice. His first wife, Sarah, died when Lizzie was only 2 years old, leaving behind 2 daughters, Emma, the eldest, and Lizzie herself. 3 years later, Andrew remarried to a woman named Abby Durfee Gray. The relationship between Abby and her 2 stepdaughters was from very early on cold at best. Lizzie, in her own later testimony, would refer to her stepmother formally as Mrs. Borden, and pointedly avoid describing their relationship as warm in any way, stating she believed Abby had married her father chiefly for his money. Bridget Sullivan, the family's live-in maid, would later testify that Lizzie and Emma rarely even shared meals with their father and stepmother, despite living under the same roof, 2 entirely separate households, functionally occupying the same modest home. Tensions in the household ran deeper than simple personal dislike. Andrew's considerable wealth and lingering questions over how his estate would eventually be divided between his wife and his 2 adult daughters created a persistent, simmering resentment. In one incident later raised at trial, Andrew killed several pigeons in the family's barn using a hatchet, believing the birds might be carrying disease. Birds Lizzie herself had reportedly built a roost for not long before, though the depth of her reaction to their killing has been disputed by different accounts over the years. By the summer of 1892, friction inside the household had grown severe enough that, following a family argument in July, both Lizzie and Emma left Fall River separately for extended visits with friends and relatives elsewhere in Massachusetts. Emma stayed away. Lizzie, notably, cut her own visit short and returned alone, and rather than heading straight back to her father's house, she spent 4 additional days staying at a local rooming house before finally returning to the family home just a week before the murders. Bridget Sullivan, the household's maid, deserves her own introduction here, since she would go on to become one of the case's most important and most quietly overlooked witnesses. 26 years old at the time of the murders, Bridget had emigrated from Ireland in 1886 and had worked for the Borden family for nearly 3 years by the summer of 1892. Andrew and his daughters, in something historians have since pointed to as a small but telling detail of the family's casual disregard for the people working under them, continued calling her Maggie, the name of the family's previous maid, rather than bothering to learn or use her actual name. In the days immediately preceding August 4th, 1892, the entire household, Andrew, Abby, Lizzie, and Bridget, fell ill with symptoms consistent with food poisoning during a brutal summer heat wave that reportedly pushed temperatures in Fall River to nearly 100 degrees. Abby grew suspicious enough of the illness to confide in a neighbor her fear that someone might be deliberately poisoning the family. It later emerged, during the investigation, that Lizzie had visited a local drugstore the day before the murders and asked a pharmacist named Eli Benz to sell her a diluted form of prussic acid, a genuinely dangerous poison, claiming she needed it to clean a fur cape. Benz refused to sell it to her without a doctor's prescription. Whether this incident had any real connection to the household's illness in the days that followed has never been definitively established, and the detail would become one of the most hotly debated pieces of circumstantial evidence in the entire case. Evidence that, in the end, the trial judge would rule inadmissible entirely on the grounds that an attempted purchase alone did not sufficiently demonstrate intent to harm. The household also had an overnight guest that week, John Vinicum Morse, Lizzie's maternal uncle, the brother of Andrew's late first wife. Morse had arrived the day before the murders for what was described as a casual family visit and slept in the upstairs guest bedroom, the very room in which Abby Borden would be killed the following morning. On the morning of Thursday, August 4th, 1892, the household's routine proceeded largely as normal, despite the lingering illness and oppressive heat. Bridget rose first, around 6 o'clock, lit the stove, and prepared breakfast. Andrew, Abby, and John Morse ate together downstairs around 7, lingering at the table for close to an hour discussing business matters. Lizzie, who reportedly had been up late the previous night, did not come down for the meal. Sometime between 9 and 10:30 that morning, Morse left the house to visit other relatives elsewhere in the city, a visit that would later provide him with what investigators privately described as an almost suspiciously precise and thoroughly detailed alibi, airtight enough that some later researchers have specifically flagged its unusual completeness as, in itself, a point worth questioning. Andrew left separately to run errands in town. Abby went upstairs to tidy the guest bedroom where Morse had slept, dusting and arranging pillowcases for an anticipated future guest. Bridget went outside to begin washing the home's exterior windows, a task that would keep her moving in and out of the house over the following hour. At some point during that window, while Bridget worked outside and Lizzie's own precise location remains, even now, a matter of dispute, Abby Borden was struck from behind with a hatchet in the upstairs guest bedroom. 19 times, according to the later autopsy, the blows landing with such force and precision that investigators believe she almost certainly died within moments of the very first strike, likely without ever turning to see who had attacked her. Around 11 o'clock, Andrew Borden returned home from his errands, still unwell from the household's recent illness, and settled onto the sitting room sofa to rest, removing his coat and lying down with his eyes apparently closed. Bridget, exhausted from her morning's labor and her own lingering sickness, went up to her small attic bedroom to lie down herself, later testifying she may not have been fully asleep, a detail that has troubled researchers for over a century, given that her bedroom sat almost directly above the sitting room where Andrew would shortly be killed, and she reported hearing nothing at all. According to Lizzie's own account, given at the time and repeated with variations afterward, she had been in the barn's upper loft during this period, searching for a piece of lead to use as fishing tackle, and heard what she later described as a heavy fall accompanied by a soft groaning sound as she made her way back toward the house. Approaching the building, she noticed the screen door standing open and went inside. It was Lizzie's cries that brought Bridget rushing down from her attic room. Bridget would later testify to hearing Lizzie call out urgently from the bottom of the stairs, telling her to come quickly, that her father was dead, that someone had come in and killed him. Andrew Borden had been struck at least 10 to 11 times with a sharp-edged instrument. The blows concentrated almost entirely on his head and face, with enough force that one strike had cleanly split one of his eyes in two. He had, by every appearance, been killed while resting with his eyes closed on the sitting room sofa. A detail investigators found deeply significant, since it strongly suggested his attacker had been able to approach closely and strike repeatedly, without him ever waking or attempting to defend himself in any way. Abby Borden's body would not be discovered for some time afterward. Lizzie sent Bridget across the street to fetch the family's doctor. And in the initial chaos following the discovery of Andrew's body, no one immediately thought to ask where Mrs. Borden herself might be. According to Bridget's testimony, it was only after she returned with a neighbor, Mrs. Churchill, that Lizzie mentioned believing she'd heard Abby come back into the house earlier that morning and asked the two women to go upstairs and check. They climbed the front stairs together and found Abby's body face down on the floor of the guest bedroom, already cold. She had clearly been dead considerably longer than her husband, whose body was still warm when first discovered. What followed was, by the standards of any era, an almost immediate and intense focus on Lizzie as the primary suspect, a focus that only deepened as her own behavior in the following days struck investigators, neighbors, and eventually the entire country as strange, evasive, and deeply inconsistent. On the very morning of the murders, responding police officers did not thoroughly search Lizzie's own bedroom, apparently out of a mix of social deference toward her as a woman of her class and consideration for her reported distress and illness. When Deputy Marshal John Fleet pressed her during initial questioning about who might be responsible, Lizzie offered only a vague suggestion that it might have been a man her father had argued with weeks earlier, without providing any name or further detail investigators could actually pursue. When asked directly whether Bridget Sullivan or John Morse could have committed the murders, her responses were, by most accounts, similarly non-committal. Investigators searched the family's barn, hoping to verify Lizzie's account of having spent time up in its loft that morning searching for fishing tackle. What they found cast immediate doubt on her story, a thick, undisturbed layer of dust across the loft floor, showing no sign that anyone had walked through it recently at all, a detail suggesting Lizzie had not, in fact, spent the 20 or so minutes there that she claimed. It would take until August 6th, 2 full days after the murders, before a more thorough search of the house was finally carried out, at which point Lizzie was formally informed she was now considered a suspect. During that search, officers discovered several hatchets in the basement. One, stained with what appeared to be blood and hair, turned out on closer examination to be nothing more than the remains of a butchered cow. 3 others were simply old, rusted, and clearly undisturbed. But a 4th item, a hatchet head, separated from its handle, covered in a layer of ash and dust that investigators would later argue looked deliberately, rather than naturally applied, became the prosecution's central piece of physical evidence, on the theory that the handle had been broken off and destroyed specifically because it would have been soaked in blood. Officers also discovered a pail in the basement containing what looked like blood-stained clothing or rags. When questioned, Lizzie attributed this to her own menstruation, and in a decision that would later draw considerable modern scrutiny and criticism, investigators of the era simply declined to examine the pail's contents any further out of Victorian-era social delicacy. Bridget herself would later note, with some evident suspicion of her own, that she did not recall seeing that particular pail while doing the family's laundry earlier in the week, by which point, however, its contents had already been quietly disposed of. The following day, August 7th, Lizzie was observed by her sister Emma and a family friend, Alice Russell, tearing apart and burning a dress in the kitchen stove. When questioned, she explained the dress had been ruined by fresh paint and was no longer of any use, an explanation no one present could independently corroborate, and one made considerably more damaging by its timing. Just one day after she had been formally told she was a suspect in an active double murder investigation. At a formal inquest held over 3 days that August, Lizzie's own testimony did little to help her case. Contemporary observers describe her demeanor as strikingly calm, at times almost detached, while she gave shifting, at points directly contradictory, accounts of her own precise whereabouts and movements in the house during the critical window when her father was killed. She repeatedly avoided directly answering questions that, had she answered them clearly and consistently, might well have strengthened her own position. She was arrested on August 11th, the final day of the inquest, and formally indicted by a grand jury that December. Beyond Lizzie herself, investigators and, later, generations of amateur and professional researchers alike considered several other possible suspects, none of whom were ever seriously pursued by Fall River's own limited, underfunded police force at the time. Bridget Sullivan herself has occasionally been raised as a candidate. She was, after all, present in the house the entire morning, moving in and out for her window-washing chores, in a position to have observed or even participated in events she never fully disclosed. Decades after the murders, following her eventual move to Butte, Montana, where she married and lived out the rest of her life under her real name, with no one in her new community aware of her connection to the infamous case, Bridget reportedly gave a deathbed confession to her sister, in which she claimed to have altered certain details of her original trial testimony specifically to help protect Lizzie. The claim, if true, has never been independently verified, and Bridget died in 1948 without ever publicly elaborating on it further. John Morse, Lizzie's visiting uncle, has also drawn sustained suspicion over the decades since. He was, by his own account, one of the very last people to see both Andrew and Abby Borden alive, having breakfasted with them that same morning before leaving the house. His alibi, for the remainder of the morning, a visit to other relatives elsewhere in the city, was, according to some later researchers, almost suspiciously airtight and thoroughly detailed, the kind of alibi that leave investigators wondering whether it was constructed with unusual care, specifically because it might be needed. One modern researcher, a Massachusetts schoolteacher named Richard Little, went so far as to build an entire theory implicating Morse directly, pointing to a reportedly failing joint business venture between Morse and Andrew Borden as a possible financial motive, and noting that Morse's own professional background as a butcher would have given him considerable practical skill with a bladed instrument. Little further speculated that Morse may have had knowledge of the contents of Andrew's will, potentially giving him independent motive of his own. A more exotic theory implicates a man named William Borden, believed by some researchers, including author Arnold Brown, to have been Andrew's illegitimate son from before his first marriage. Brown's theory suggests William may have attempted, and failed, to extort money from the father who had never publicly acknowledged him, with the murders representing a final, violent escalation of that failed extortion attempt. And beyond these named individuals, witnesses at the original trial described a series of unidentified, suspicious figures seen lingering near the Borden property in the days surrounding the murders. A pale, unsettling young man reportedly seen leaning against the family's front gatepost on the very day of the killings, and a separate figure, seated silently on the sidewalk near a neighboring home the night before, who reportedly did not respond when neighbors attempted to speak with him, despite showing no obvious signs of intoxication. None of these figures were ever identified. None of the alternative theories involving Bridget, Morse, or the mysterious drifters was ever pursued with anything approaching the intensity directed at Lizzie herself. A discrepancy that some modern historians have connected directly to the deep class, gender, and ethnic biases of 1890s Fall River, where the idea of a wealthy, respectable Protestant woman committing such violence was, to many at the time, almost as unthinkable as the idea of seriously investigating the city's Irish Catholic and Portuguese immigrant communities as anything other than convenient default suspects. The trial itself, beginning in June of 1893, became what newspapers of the era did not hesitate to call the trial of the century, a description that, given the century still had 90-some years left to run, turned out to be more than a little premature, but which accurately captured the sheer scale of public fascination the case generated at the time, with reporters filing daily dispatches followed closely by readers across the entire country. The prosecution's case, led by attorney Hosea Knowlton, rested almost entirely on circumstantial evidence, and it showed under cross-examination. The hatchet head, presented as the likely murder weapon, was undermined by contradictory police testimony. One officer recalled finding a broken handle near the head at the scene, while another officer directly disputed that account, and the resulting confusion left jurors with no clear, consistent physical link between the weapon and the crime. No blood-stained clothing belonging to Lizzie was ever recovered, despite the extraordinarily bloody nature of both attacks. A gap the defense, led by former Massachusetts Governor George Robinson, repeatedly and effectively highlighted, forcing the prosecution to rely almost entirely on the burned dress and ask jurors to draw their own inferences about what it might have concealed. The testimony from stomach content analysis performed on both victims, intended to help pin down the exact time of death and establish precisely how long a gap separated the two murders, added detail but little clarity to the overall timeline. On June 20th, 1893, after a deliberation, contemporary newspaper accounts placed at a remarkably brief 40 minutes. Though some later, more detailed sources suggest deliberations may have stretched closer to 90 minutes. The all-male, entirely white Protestant jury returned its verdict: not guilty on all counts. Lizzie reportedly nearly fainted in the courtroom upon hearing the words. Leaving the courthouse, she told the assembled reporters she was, in that moment, the happiest woman in the world. No one else was ever charged with the murders of Andrew and Abby Borden. The case has never, in the more than a century since, been officially solved. Despite her acquittal, Lizzie was never able to escape the shadow of the trial for the rest of her life. Though legally exonerated, she was widely shunned by the very Fall River community she continued living in, a city that, whatever 12 jurors had decided, had largely already made up its own mind long before the verdict was ever read. Following the trial, Lizzie changed the spelling of her own name, going by Lizbeth for the remainder of her life, and used part of her substantial inheritance to purchase a large, modern home on French Street that she named Maplecroft. 7 bedrooms, 6 fireplaces, and, notably, all the indoor plumbing her father's own, considerably wealthier household had gone without. She lived there for over 3 decades, her relationship with her sister, Emma, slowly deteriorating until the two women, who had once cut short separate trips specifically to stand together during the darkest period of both their lives, eventually stopped speaking altogether, living apart for years before either of their deaths. Lizzie died of pneumonia in June of 1927 at the age of 66. Emma died just 9 days later, in what many have since noted as one of the case's quieter, sadder final footnotes. The house at what is now 230 2nd Street in Fall River. Its original address of 92 2nd Street changed since the murders, specifically because of the case's enduring, uncomfortable fame, still stands today, built originally in 1845 by a local builder named Charles C. Trafton, decades before the Bordens ever purchased it. The property changed hands several times across the 20th century. One set of owners, whose grandparents purchased the home in 1948, held it for decades afterward. In 1996, the house was formally converted into a museum and bed and breakfast, allowing overnight guests to book the very rooms where Andrew and Abby Borden died, sleep surrounded by period-accurate Victorian furnishings, and take guided daytime tours walking through the entire timeline of the murders, the deeply flawed investigation, and the sensational trial that followed. In 2021, the property was purchased for $2 million by a company specializing in guided ghost tours across the country, which has continued operating it as both a historical museum and an overnight paranormal attraction. The reports from staff and guests who have stayed there over the years form a long and remarkably consistent list. Visitors have described hearing a woman softly crying late at night in the guest bedroom where Abby was killed. Unexplained cold spots have been reported moving independently through specific rooms of the house, with no draft or air conditioning source to account for them. Guests staying in the small attic room, once occupied by Bridget Sullivan, have reported the sound of what they describe as children's laughter, along with occasional sightings of a small boy near the doorway, a figure some tour guides connect to a since-demolished neighboring property, though no verified historical account confirms a child ever died on the grounds. Visitors in multiple separate accounts have described the specific, unnerving sensation of being watched from the sitting room doorway, the exact spot where Andrew Borden was found resting in the final moments before someone ended his life. Some overnight guests, sleeping in what is now called the John Morse Room, report a persistent, heavy unease particular to that specific space. Paranormal investigators using modern equipment have reported capturing unexplained cold readings, recorded voices with no clear source, and, according to some visitors, thermal imaging anomalies resembling a full human figure in rooms that were, at the time, otherwise empty. It's worth pausing on this part of the story, as with the other cases we've covered, with an honest and clear eye. The Lizzie Borden house today operates, quite openly, as a commercial paranormal attraction, one whose gift shop sells hatchet-shaped earrings, axe-wielding teddy bears, and t-shirts referencing the murders directly, and whose overnight packages are explicitly marketed around the promise of a frightening, sleepless night. That commercial reality doesn't necessarily mean every report from every visitor is invented. Old Victorian houses genuinely do produce creaks, settling sounds, and drafts capable of unsettling even a skeptical guest, and the powerful suggestive effect of sleeping in a room where a real, unsolved axe murder took place is, on its own, more than enough to make an ordinary house sound feel like something else entirely. But it's equally true that a business whose core appeal depends on convincing paying guests they might encounter something genuinely supernatural has, at minimum, a clear financial incentive to encourage exactly that interpretation of whatever those guests happen to experience. What can be said with total certainty, stripped of ghost stories and tour guide theatrics entirely, is only this. Shortly before 11 o'clock on the morning of August 4th, 1892, someone entered the Borden home and killed Abby Borden with a hatchet. Roughly an hour later, that same person, or someone else entirely, did the same thing to Andrew Borden in the same house, while at least one other person, Bridget Sullivan, remained inside or immediately around the property the entire time, and somehow heard nothing at all. More than 130 years later, the Borden murders remain exactly what that brief, 40-minute jury deliberation left them. A genuine, still officially unsolved double homicide, inside a house full of financial grievances, cold family relationships, quiet class and ethnic prejudice, and a woman who was tried, judged not guilty by 12 of her peers, and spent every remaining day of her life unable to convince the rest of the world of the same thing. Thank you for watching. If this story kept you up tonight, subscribe to the Fear Spot for more true documented cases where nightmares come alive.